Hello, and thanks for stopping by. With Christmas approaching and a distinct chill in the air, I think now would be the perfect time to embark upon another exploration of London's historic pubs. The cosier, the better. In this video, I've selected 10 taverns, so please do be sure to pace yourself if you're drinking along, all of which share a connection with London's greatest novelist, that of course being Charles Dickens. The pubs we're about to see are all places in which Dickens himself drank, and in most cases, he was so familiar with them, he even incorporated them into his own novels. As we prepare to set off, I would just like to say a quick thank you to you for deciding to join me on this tour. And if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you could please consider subscribing to Rob's London, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish future videos. Likes and shares are also very much appreciated. Anyway, on that note, wrap up warm and we'll get going. Located just around the corner from the Palace of Westminster, the Red Lion can lay claim to a very long history indeed. The first inn to stand at this spot opened way back in 1435 and was initially known as Hopping Hall, which in my opinion is a great name for a pub. Shame they changed it. Hopping Hall was purchased by the Crown during the reign of King Henry VIII. Back then it pretty much lay within the grounds of the old Whitehall Palace, and it changed its name several times over the years, eventually settling for the Red Lion, which, it is said, was at the behest of King James I, who wanted to see his Scottish heritage acknowledged within signage on certain buildings, the Red Lion rampant being a symbol displayed on a royal banner of Scotland. We come now then to Charles Dickens, who was very fond of booze. Wine, beer, gin, punch, you name it, he drank it. And it would seem his love affair of alcohol started in the early 19th century at this very pub, back when he was barely a teenager. You see, despite having a well-paid job with the Royal Navy, Charles's father, John Dickens, was, as his own son would later describe, a jovial opportunist with no money sense. And in his attempts to live the high life, John Dickens eventually plunged the family into debt, landing him in the dreaded Marshalsea prison, which we'll be seeing a bit more of later. This occurred in February 1824, when Charles was aged just 12, and as a consequence, he ended up working in a boots polish factory on Chandos Place, Covent Garden, the site of which is now marked by a plaque. He also found lodgings in a home on Lant Street, Borough, very close to the old prison, and as you can probably imagine, the young Dickens quickly learnt how to fend for himself during his turbulent period. It was in this context, on what's believed to be his 13th birthday, that Charles Dickens found himself wandering into Westminster's Red Lion. In his own words, "I remember one evening I'd been somewhere for my father, and was going back to the Borough over Westminster Bridge. I went into a public house on Parliament Street, which is still there, at the corner of Derby Gate, and asked the landlord behind the bar, 'What is your best, the very best, ale in a glass?' 'Twopence,' says he. 'Then,' says I, 'just draw me a glass of that if you please, with a good head to it.'" Back when this happened in the 1820s, it was perfectly possible for a child to do this, as age restrictions on purchasing alcohol would not be introduced in Britain for another 100 years or so. In Dickens' Oliver Twist, for example, one of the first things the Artful Dodger does upon meeting Oliver is to buy him a pot of beer. Nevertheless, Dickens did say that the Red Lion's landlord seemed apprehensive to serve someone so young, and believed he compromised by discreetly pouring him a weaker strength beer. Dickens also recalled how, apparently moved by his plight, the landlord's wife opened a little half door and, bending, gave me a kiss that was half admiring and half compassionate, but all womanly and good, I am sure. This was a scene he'd later replicate almost word for word in his 1849 semi-autobiographical work, David Copperfield, which included an accompanying illustration entitled "My Magnificent Order at the Public House." The Red Lion as Dickens knew it was demolished in 1899, and replaced with the current incarnation soon after. If you look up, you'll see the Victorian builders incorporated a stone plaque bearing his portrait. Being so close to Parliament and Downing Street, many Prime Ministers have also drunk here whilst in office, every single one up to Edward Heath. Although if recent scandals are anything to go by, it would seem today's leaders prefer to indulge in illicit wine parties in the garden of Number 10. Plenty of politicians do still come by here though, and it's for this reason that the Red Lion has a division bell, which briefly rings like a fire alarm whenever a vote is about to be cast in Parliament. When that happens, it means MPs are required to drop what they're doing and get back to work. Sticking with government, there's a particularly intriguing bit of modern folklore associated with this pub. During the Cold War, a vast bunker, codenamed Burlington, was secretly forged within an old quarry just outside the Vulture town of Corsham, which, in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack, was intended to act as the central government war headquarters. This vast bunker, which has since been declassified, contains many miles of tunnels, amongst which were once all manner of amenities, including offices, a hospital, and a BBC studio. Dealing with World War III would have no doubt required a stiff drink, and so naturally, the Burlington bunker was also kitted out with a bar, which, according to rumour, was dubbed the Red Lion, in honour of its famous Whitehall cousin. The Grapes, originally known as the Bunch of Grapes, has a history dating back to 1583, when it began pouring beer for those working in the nearby docks and lime kilns, which, by the way, is where this area, Limehouse, gets its name from. Today, the Grapes is owned by a small consortium who hold a great passion for this historic pub, the most famous member of which is the legendary actor Sir Ian McKellen. If you're lucky enough, you can sometimes find him propping up the bar in here. The building as it stands today dates from the 1720s, appearing much as it would have done in Dickens' day, and like the Red Lion, the Grapes was a pub he knew from an early age, having first become acquainted with it when paying visits to his godfather, Christopher Huffam, the fellow who Dickens held a great affection for. Christopher ran a cell-making business in Limehouse, and whenever young Charles popped by, he'd always do his best to encourage his godson's performative side, offering him coins to dance and sing comical songs, sometimes, it's claimed, on top of the bar counter in the Grapes pub. This encouragement paid off, for as well as being an acclaimed writer, Dickens continued to enjoy amateur dramatics as an adult, and he'd later be celebrated for his lively public readings, in which he'd bring his own characters vividly to life. As an adult, Dickens often returned to Limehouse to seek inspiration in the district's grubby back streets and illicit opium dens, and he would later include the Grapes in his last complete novel, Our Mutual Friend. In that story, in which he changed the name of the pub to the Six Jolly Fellowship Porters, he described the building as being a tavern of dropsical appearance, long settled down into a state of hale infirmity. In its whole constitution, it had not a straight floor, and hardly a straight line, but it had outlasted, and clearly would yet outlast many a better trimmed building, many a sprucer public house. If you visit the Grapes, be sure to head towards the back, where a small balcony offers a marvellous vista of the Thames, including a view of this sculpture by the artist Anthony Gormley, entitled Another Time 16, which stands marooned in the river, peering towards the towers of Canary Wharf. The back parlour also contains a complete collection of Charles Dickens' works, which you're more than welcome to read. A lovely way to spend a quiet afternoon, I'm sure you'll agree. When it comes to taverns which feature in the novels of Charles Dickens, the Georgian Vulture, deep within the city's historic square mole, is easily the most prominent, for it's name-checked in his first novel, 1837's The Pickwick Papers, well over 20 times. In chapter 26, for example, Dickens tells us that Mr. Pickwick and Sam, took up their present abode in very good, old-fashioned and comfortable quarters, to wit, the George and Vulture on Lombard Street. Mr. Pickwick had dined, finished his second pint of particular port, pulled his silk handkerchief over his head, put his feet on the fender, and thrown himself back in an easy chair, when the entrance of Mr. Weller with his carpet bag aroused him from his tranquil meditation. As with the other establishments on this tour, the George and Vulture has a very long history indeed. There's been an inn on this site since the 1100s, and it's even mentioned in John Stow's Survey of London, which, first published in 1598, was essentially the city's first travel guide. For the first few centuries of its life, the tavern was simply called the George. It changed to its current name in the wake of the Great Fire of London, when a wine merchant re-established his business at the site. Apparently, this fellow had advertised his previous wine warehouse, which had been lost to the flames, by keeping a live vulture tethered outside, a sort of living sign if you will. It was for this reason that the word vulture was added to the George, although mercifully, the landlord strictly forbade the reintroduction of a live bird. The current building dates from 1748, and so was already around 90 years old when dear old Mr. Pickwick became a regular. The George and Vulture also straddles two historical parishes, those being St Michael's Cornhill and St Edmund the King. You can see the border markers outside the tavern's entrance on St Michael's Alley. Thanks to its close connection with the Pickwick papers, the City Pickwick Club, which was founded in 1909, meets here 4 times a year, and after each dinner, they always offer a toast to the immortal memory of Charles Dickens. As well as its connection with the Pickwick papers, it's also possible that Dickens had the George and Vulture in mind when writing A Christmas Carol, in which he describes Ebenezer Scrooge taking his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, before heading home for the hauntings that will ensue. The other contender for this is Simpsons Tavern, which sits just around the corner. Although sadly, at the time of making this video, this historic institution is closed, and has been for some time, due to a dispute with the landlord. There is a fundraising campaign to save Simpsons Tavern. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. When it comes to Charles Dickens' favourite pubs, the Old Cheshire Cheese, an institution that's tucked away off of Fleet Street and packed with all manner of rooms and character, is arguably the most famous, and he wasn't the only literary great to enjoy a pint here. Dr. Samuel Johnson, Mark Twain, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Oliver Goldsmith, P.G. Wodehouse, and George Orwell are all known to have popped by here too. Charles Dickens' favourite spot here was in the dining room, beside the red curtain and fireplace, and he featured the Old Cheshire Cheese in Chapter 4 of his 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities, when Mr. Carton takes Charles Darnay down Ludgate Hill to Fleet Street, and up a covered way into a tavern. Here they were shown into a little room, where Charles Darnay was soon recruiting his strength with a good plain dinner and good wine, while Carton sat opposite him at the same table, with a separate bottle of port before him, and his fully half-insolent manner upon him. As for the history of the Old Cheshire Cheese, well, I have already covered that in considerable depth in a previous video. If you haven't seen that episode yet, I'll leave a link to it in the description below, so you can check it out once you're done here. In centuries past, this site in Greenwich was home to a small pub called the Old George, which enjoyed good business thanks to its proximity to Woolwich Dockyard and the local fishing industry. In 1830, this success encouraged the landlord to expand the premises, and so he hired the services of Joseph Kay, an architect who'd already designed a number of other buildings in Greenwich. However, Joseph was also quick to spot the site's potential as a nice little earner, and so, it's alleged, he sabotaged the planning application and then muscled his way in to acquire the Old George all for himself. Sounds like just the sort of thing a nefarious character in a Charles Dickens novel would do, doesn't it? Once Joseph Kay had his grubby hands on the property, he knocked down the Old George and built the pub we see today, opening it in 1837 and christening it the Trafalgar Tavern in honour of Lord Nelson and the area's connections with the Royal Navy. Charles Dickens liked to visit the Trafalgar Tavern for its famous whitebait suppers, and both William Thackeray and Wilkie Collins are other writers who are known to have come here too. It's believed the Trafalgar Tavern is the place Dickens had in mind when describing the Greenwich location of the wedding dinner in Our Mutual Friend, telling the reader, "What a dinner! Specimens of all the fishes that swim in the sea surely had swum their way to it." In the early 20th century, the Trafalgar Tavern fell out of use as a pub. After the First World War, it became a home for elderly sailors, followed by a stint as a centre for the unemployed during the Great Depression. In the Second World War, it accommodated naval officers, and was finally renovated and reinstated as a pub, easily now one of the largest in London, in 1968. Tucked away on Cromer Street, close to King's Cross and St Pancras stations, the Boot can trace its roots back to the 17th century. Back then it was known as the Golden Boot, and stood in what was then a largely rural area, close to where the now submerged River Fleet once flowed above ground. Because of this, there has been some speculation in the past that the tavern used to be called the Boat, a name which morphed over time to become the similar sounding Boot. Due to the open space which once surrounded it, the Boot used to be more of a pleasure garden, offering a tea room, a skittle alley and a bowling green, which all sounds rather pleasant, doesn't it? Although in those days, such places were notorious for attracting drunkenness and rowdy behaviour. The Boot has been rebuilt several times over the centuries. For many decades it was owned by the Speedy family, whose name is recalled in the neighbouring news. And it was a pub Dickens knew well, having once lived just a short walk away on Doughty Street. It was at the Boot, in around 1851, that Dickens was introduced to a fellow named Henry Shepherd Medhurst, who demonstrated his skill of shorthand by quickly scribbling down notes as Dickens read aloud from a newspaper. So impressed was Dickens at the speed at which Henry wrote, the author hired him as an assistant whilst working on A Child's History of England, a little known work which is the only book Dickens dictated rather than directly penning down himself. Dickens also made great use of the Boot in 1841's Barnaby Rudge, which uses the Gordon riots of 1780 as a backdrop, the pub being a hangout that's popular with the drunken anti-Catholic mob, which is somewhat ironic as the Boot is now an Irish pub. As they were thirsty by this time, Dickens tells us in chapter 38, Dennis proposed that they should repair together to the Boot, where there was good company and strong liquor. The Boot was a lone house of public entertainment, situated in the fields at the back of the Foundling Hospital, Dickens explains. A very solitary spot at that period, and quite deserted after dark. The tavern stood at some distance from any high road, and was approachable only by a dark and narrow lane, so that you were surprised to find several people drinking there, and great merriment going on. Another pub close to Doughty Street, so close in fact that it was, for several years, arguably Dickens' local, is the lovely Lamb Tavern. Despite the symbology though, the origins of this pub's name aren't related to sheep. Lamb in this case is in fact a reference to William Lamb, a kind-hearted philanthropist who made his fortune as a cloth merchant. You can see his bust inside St James's Church, Islington. In 1564, one of William Lamb's many good deeds was to donate £1,500 towards the repair of the Holborn Conduit, a system which piped fresh water into the city. This was a huge sum for the time, roughly equivalent to £500,000 in today's money, so it's only fair then that he gets to have a pub named after him, along with the street, Lamb's Conduit Street, upon which it stands. There's a memorial fountain to William Lamb here too. The Lamb pub was established in the 1720s, so would have already been over 100 years old when Charles Dickens moved to nearby Doughty Street in 1837. The incarnation we see today was built in the Victorian era and is notable for its so-called snob screens, little glazed windows along the bar which can be turned open or closed depending on how you wish. Once a common feature in many 19th century pubs, snob screens were designed to offer customers privacy, whilst at the same time allowing staff to discreetly keep a tab on things. The troubled poets Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath often met here in the early stages of their relationship, and the Lamb also happens to stand just around the corner from Great Ormond Street's Children's Hospital, which owes a great deal to Charles Dickens, for he did much to promote the institution when it first opened in 1852. In a magazine article entitled Drooping Buds, for example, he wrote, "Of all the coffins that are made in London, more than 1 in every 3 is made for a little child, a child that has not yet 2 figures to its age. Although science has advanced, although vaccination has been discovered and brought into general use, although medical knowledge is tenfold greater than it was 50 years ago, we still do not gain more than a diminution of 2% in the terrible mortality amongst our children." Dickens then went on to provide a description of the fledgling Children's Hospital, which was then only a few weeks old, and several years later, when Great Ormond Street required more space, he staged a charity reading, which raised enough money to purchase the entire neighbouring building, thus enabling the hospital's first expansion and significantly boosting the number of beds. Just a brief glimpse of the George, in Borough, is more than enough to tell you that it's easily one of London's most historic pubs, proven by the fact that, as well as Dickens, it also has close connections with Chaucer and Shakespeare. The George is the city's only surviving galleried coaching inn, a place where, in the days before railway travel, people would come to catch long-distance stagecoaches, the tavern offering them food, drink and accommodation whilst they waited, rather like an early form of departure lounge. There were once several such inns crowded along Borough High Street, and sadly, even the George has lost a large chunk of its original layout. These balconies would have once stretched all the way around the central courtyard, and as you can see here, these long lost sections have since been plugged in with a rather bland bit of modern architecture. There has been a tavern on this site since medieval times, and the George we see today dates from 1677. Dickens knew this place well, and like the Red Lion and the Grapes which we saw earlier, it was a tavern he would have first encountered at an early age. This is because the Marshalsea prison, in which his father was locked up for debt in 1824, was located just a short walk away, and if you venture down Borough High Street, you can still see an old wall from the grim jail, sandwiched between Angel Place and St George's Churchyard Garden. Both the Marshalsea prison and the neighbouring St George de Martyr Church feature in Dickens's Little Dorrit, which was serialised between 1855 and 1857, and the George is briefly mentioned in chapter 22, when Maggie suggests that Edward Dorrit, aka Tip, should retire there to write a letter. In chapter 10 of the Pickwick Papers, Dickens provides a vivid description of the area's coaching taverns, as they appeared at the time. In the borough especially, there still remain some half-dozen old inns, which have preserved their external features unchanged, and which have escaped alike the rage for public improvement and the encroachments of private speculation. Great, rambling, queer old places they are, with galleries and passages, and staircases wide enough and antiquated enough to furnish materials for 100 ghost stories. The northern end of Borough High Street is now dominated by a lofty railway junction, through which trains rumble to and from London Bridge Station, and for a time, the London and North Eastern Railway Company actually owned the George. You can see a sign for their goods office in this old photograph. The railway handed the pub over to the National Trust in March 1937, and it was renovated and strengthened the following year, miraculously avoiding damage in the war that would erupt soon after. Prior to that, the London and North Eastern had allowed various Dickens-related events to take place at the George, including open-air plays, and on Christmas Eve 1935, a special Dickensian dinner, the menu of which contained a boar's head, spiced walnut salad, and orange jelly, all washed down with plenty of ale and accompanied by Victorian clay tobacco pipes. A few weeks after that dinner, in February 1936, a further celebration took place at the George to mark Charles Dickens' birthday, and interestingly, the Times reported that this involved a procession to nearby Lant Street, an address Dickens had lodged at as a boy, where a wreath was laid at the foot of the Dickens statue. No such statue exists today on Lant Street, or indeed anywhere else in London, and I've not been able to find any image of it or record related to when it was made. The only similar artefact I can think of is a bust of the author, which is now displayed in Waterhouse Square, within the old Prudential Assurance building on Holborn, this being the former site of Furnival's Inn, another place where Dickens used to live. Did this bust once stand on Lant Street? Or was the statue mentioned destroyed in the war, or moved elsewhere? If you have any information, please do help me solve this mystery in the comments. Dating back to 1585, the splendid Spaniards Inn up in Hampstead features in chapter 46 of the Pickwick Papers. Mr. Pickwick and his friends certainly got around a bit, didn't they? In those days, Hampstead was a village on the outskirts of London, and it took quite a trek to get there. As Dickens says, the party walked forth in quest of a Hampstead stage. This was soon found, and in a couple of hours, they all arrived safely in the Spaniards' tea gardens. The rural setting is enhanced further when Mrs. Rogers sighs, "How sweet is the country! I almost wish I lived in it always." I'm not quite sure if she'd be of the same opinion today though, if she could see the amount of traffic that now passes through. The Spaniards Inn is also famous for featuring in Bram Stoker's masterpiece, Dracula, and like the old Cheshire cheese, it's a pub which I've covered in some detail in previous videos. Please be sure to check out the links below to find out more. The George IV is particularly interesting in that it's owned by the London School of Economics. I'm not sure how many other universities can boast they possess such an historic watering hole. The first incarnation of this tavern was known as the Magpie and Stump, and in Dickens' day it was located in the midst of a scruffy area known as Clare Market, most of which was swept away at the turn of the 20th century as part of a slum clearance, paving the way for the grand thoroughfares known as Kingsway and Aldwych. Dickens featured the tavern, back when it was known as the Magpie and Stump, in, as you may well have guessed by now, the Pickwick Papers. It provides the backdrop to chapter 20, with Dickens describing it thus. In the lower windows, which were decorated with curtains of a saffron hue, dangled 2 or 3 printed cards bearing reference to Devonshire cider and Danzig spruce, which was a very strong dark beer in those days. While on a large blackboard, announcing in white letters to an enlightened public that there were 50,000 barrels of stout in the cellars of the establishment, left the mind in a state of not unpleasing doubt and uncertainty as to the precise direction in the bowels of the earth in which this mighty cavern might be supposed to extend. The old pub was purchased for £7,550 in 1897, soon after which it was promptly knocked down, making way for the impressive building we see today. If you enjoy railway history, the George IV is well worth a visit, as there's an interesting piece of memorabilia to be found here, that being this nameplate, which now holds pride of place above the bar. It was once attached to the Class 86 locomotive 86421, which was given the name the London School of Economics in October 1985 in honour of the university. When the engine was decommissioned in the early 2000s, the nameplate was gifted to the university, with the pub providing the perfect home. As well as the George IV, the London School of Economics also own another building with the Charles Dickens link, that being the Old Curiosity Shop, which you'll find just a few moments from the pub. But that's a story for another time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and would also like to take this opportunity to wish you a very happy Christmas and the best of luck for the new year. I'd also love to hear your own thoughts on these Dickensian pubs. Have you visited any of them? Which is your favourite? And do you have any possible leads on the long lost Dickens statue which apparently stood in Lant Street? If so, please do be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.